We've done an awful lot of the hard work that we need to do. Our interface is complete, the GUI is complete, and all the controls are there on all of the forms that we're going to need when we go through the application and run the data through it. You'll remember a long time in videos, a long time ago in 5, 6 and 7, where we created the factory class. This was the factory class which was to import data. You can remember this from last year, I'm sure, but we take a text file and it acts like a database. We get that and we return a data table from that text file by looping through the rows of the database, each one of which will contain the data for a user. Each user has a username and has a password, and we then have a class which validates whether the credentials that are entered into the text box that's on the form are correct for the user in both the username and the password, and if they are, this function validate user will return true, and that's what happens here. If validated, then true. Otherwise it's going to be false, and it will be initialized to false and never changes from false because it never validates to true. So what we're going to do next is we're going to put some names on our controls that we're going to use and then implement this code. So let's talk about the data file before we actually start to implement it. It's called users.txt and it's on my D drive. And as I think I said to you last year, put it as close to the root of a drive as you can possibly do. Now in yours, it may be in your C drive. You just put it in your C drive right at the root, users.txt. Why? Because it reduces the length of the name of the path that you have to use in your code, and it just reduces the likelihood of there being any errors. So what data does it contain? We've got the two entries here for our users. Username and password separated by a comma, Paul, TT, etc., Mariam, and so forth. So we'll use this data, and what we'll do is we'll hard code it into the control so that we can use this for debug purposes. And you would obviously remove that when you get to the stage of issuing the file out to the end user so that their own data can be reinterrogated rather than what you've used for debug. So I will, in due course, copy this from the username. I'll use my credentials, not Mariam's, and I'll copy it into the controls in the login form so that that data will be hard coded. So let's start on that. So here's the XAML for the login page, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this data, which I know for obviously my name is Paul. I can remember that just, even though I'm terribly old and stupid. But I'm going to copy this password off here, and in this text box I'm going to put the text Paul. Okay, so there it is there. And in this text box, I'm going to put the password, which is that. So that means that just during debug, when we start this application up, it will have this text in it. And what we can do is we can just validate that this works as a correct login, because it should, because these are the entries in my database. So it should check those and it should return true when those are validated. So both of our text boxes now have values in them. Remembering that the way in which this works in XAML is that the text box opens with a chevron, and then it closes with a chevron, and then it has the closing chevron set there. So between the two tags, you put the text you want to display, Paul, and all the properties go before that closing first tag. So I'm going to put X, that's the namespace, remember, name. And this is the control name. We obviously have to give the control a name so that when we're using code, we can refer to that control and distinguish it from all the other controls on the form. So now I'm going to talk about style. You'll see a lot of ideas about how the control name should be styled, and you'll see many people do them in different ways. I really don't care what you do. I like to see the name of the data and the type of control somewhere so that you know this is a text box and it's dealing with the username. But how you approach it is up to you, as long as, and you'll remember this from my various lectures that I've given you, be consistent, be consistent, be consistent. So that always the naming gives you a sense of what it is and you don't have to interpret it, you just have to glance at it and understand what it's doing. So here we have here, so obviously this will be password text box. So that's our two controls named, and we now know that we know what we can refer to when we're trying to check what values they have in code. Our login button already has a method signature attached to it because we've used that to navigate to the next page. So what we're going to do is use this click method. So if you just select it and press F12, it'll take you to that definition. And we'll put the validation logic here and then wrap this code after the validation, so that it only takes you to the next page if the user is properly validated. So what we're going to have to do now is we're going to have a user. So remember how we declare a user in our user, even user, my user equals new user. Visual Studio is getting more and more sensible about this because it says user. All right, it must be a new user, so it gets you a lot of IntelliSense for that. So this is our user. Now what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that the user has actually got some text in here, and that's what we'll also double check for that. We'll implement the clear button to make sure that there is something to validate, because there's no point in running the code if there's nothing to validate. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check before we assign the values to our user that we're going to do. So we're going to use an if statement. That's referring to the current control set. Username dot text is not equal to the empty string. Then we can put some code in to validate the user. We're going to say my user dot username equals this dot username dot text. So we've said if it's not empty, we're going to assign whatever is in the box to that field of the my user class. Else excuse me, message box dot show, and then a string. You must enter. I'm going really slowly, quite deliberately. A username. There's no need to shout, I suppose. Sometimes I quite like shouting actually at people, but and then because this is a void, in order to break out of that, we just put return. This is not returning a value, so we're just going to return out of the method, and it's as if nothing happened. We could actually put focus in on various controls and so forth, but we're not going to do that. So what we do is we then repeat this exercise and say if So I've done exactly the same with the password text box. I've said that if it's not null, if there's a value in it, then we'll assign what the value is to the password attribute, the data member of my user. We've now got a user populated with data. If we've got to this point, and if we haven't had this return, it's gone to this user point here, this point in the code here, we can now validate the data that we have. So when we look back at the code we're going to use in UserDB, which is the class which works out what is the credential and whether it's correct, it goes to my text file, it gets all of the data into a data table, and then it has been given a user to work with, and then user to validate is checked for each row to see whether the password, the username and the password match up. And if they do, we're going to break out with a true. It doesn't go on any further, it doesn't check it, it just, as soon as it finds one that's true, it just does break and returns out of that piece of code. So the function we're going to use is validate user, and we're going to give it a user. That user will be checked against the data that's in this particular database, as we've called it. So if we go here, and if we do if, remember this is a selection. Now, a selection is based on a conditional check. Validate, oh sorry, we have to do the UserDB. UserDB dot validate user. Which user? My user, the one we've just worked out. So we've now created the code. So it says if we get a validation on the user, let's go to the page. If not, tell the people that it's not right. We're not going anywhere. We have to get the right credentials before we can move to the next page. So let's test our code. First thing to do, of course, is build the solution, and what it does is it just finds any gross errors. I've got immediately a build succeeded. So let's run our application. Remind ourselves what should happen. I've got data in the text boxes. What should happen is that if I press the login button, this is validated against the database, and if it's true, which it should be, it will take us to the loan page. So our data is in our control, the username, and the data for the password is there, and if I press login, it takes me to the loan page, and that's been validated. So what we'll now do is we will check and do a debug, and this would be part of your error checking planning and your test plan. So let's do this. And just change one letter on here. I think that's easier to do that. User credentials are incorrect. Is that going to be true if we do H again on the password? User credentials are incorrect. That's good. If I do a cut, you must enter a password. Put it back. Do a cut. You must enter a username. So we're getting a good set of error checks on here, and that's our code validated. So at least we know we've got one piece of code working. That's a significant bit of progress, and you're using some nice C# against a WPF XAML background on the GUI. So we might as well finish off this form while we're here. So we've got our clear button. What should that do? It should take the text out of both of these to allow the user to have another go. So if we do our button, which is there, it shows up in our XAML editor here. So if I go before here, tab, and I've now got that. So I'm going to do just very simply this dot username dot text, the empty string, and we've now cleared those boxes. So what would we do next? We'd tidy up something here that I don't think is very good. I've hard-coded into my XAML the two values for the username and the password. it is really, really easy to forget that you've done that. So what we should do is we should take it out of the control itself and put it into a method that runs when the page starts. We've got a method here which says page login, and this is launched when the page is initialized. So what we're going to do is we're going to write a little method that's going to put some code in when the page launches. So the first thing to do is to take the data out of here. So there's the username data, password data, and there's the username data. So we've taken it out of there. Let's go back to the code behind, and I'm going to create a little method that's going to be down in here. I've got it on my clipboard, and it's called fill temp credentials. And then simply when we launch the page, we do fill temp credentials, and that will run. Now I'm not putting any comments here just yet, so we should do that. So I'm going to do there. So I've got that, and I'm using the 3/ to do that, and I'm going to say the purpose for this is so I've now got that all running, and that's a reasonable number of comments. I think in many cases you would put some header commentary up here, but not in the same way as you would do with a class, because you're using this inline commentary, and the purpose is kind of obvious. So you've got these different types of styling you can use for comments. I quite often do something like this. That's my style. You develop your own style. So that's the sort of thing that you should be doing, but not too much. You can go too silly on this. So what we need to do is we need to do another check on what we've done. And that's going to be the same as we did before. And so you can see that when we run this application, it'll do its own build and it'll start the application up. It's populated the data again. And from this very simple process, we've developed about 4 or 5 different tests that you can put into your test plan. So that's really important that you understand that this very simple thing, you wouldn't just say test the validation of the user, you'd say test the validation of the user with correct data present. Check the validation of the user with no username. Check the validation of the user with no password. Check the validation of the user with the username misspelled, and so forth. So you're going to get about 5 checks out of one simple process. Makes for a nice big fat test plan. So let's do it. Yep, it all still works absolutely fine. So I've restarted the application. Let's just check our clear button. Yeah, that works a treat. And as I said, the great benefit of putting this in centralized code under a method is that all I have to do when I'm not debugging is just comment out that one line in here. The fill temp credentials, just comment that out and you won't forget to take it out of the controls. So what I'm going to move on to next is we'll move on to the code behind for the page of the loan, and that's just going to be gathering the data into a loan class, which we'll then carry forward with us as we go through the application.